I wanted to talk about week 5 and how it's gone so far. This is a little bit different this week as I've introduced hill sprints for the first time. So for the first 4 weeks, I've just been building up doing aerobic runs. And now I've added in on a Tuesday, just some hill sprints. So I went to a massive hill, which says at the bottom that it's about 25% incline, which is huge. And I did kind of like a pyramid. So I went 2 times 10 seconds with 1 minute rest. Then I did 2 times 15 second sprints up the hill with 90-second rest, and then 2 times 20 seconds with a 2 minute rest in between, and then went back down. So 15 seconds, 90-second rest, and 10 seconds and 1 minute rest. So the reason for the long rest period is because I'm really trying to work on the strength and the power. So I need to get that full recovery basically so I can hit the hill as fast as possible again. It's not really about working a lactate threshold or anything like that. It's just trying to get as much power out of the legs and strength building more than anything else. Also interesting, this run or this week was the run I did today. So normally I'm just doing this aerobic stuff, which is trying to basically stay below lactate threshold. But I wanted to just test things out a little bit today to see where I was. So I did a 1K warm up and I did 2K at around about what I call zone 3, so 160 beats per minute, which I believe to be aerobic pacing, and then 1K at about 170, which is probably just above that lactate threshold, and then back down for 2K at 160, and then final kilometer is about 170, so another fast one. And I was kind of expecting to hit sort of maybe around 4 minutes 15 a kilometer for the really threshold runs where I'm sort of pushing it above 170 beats per minute. And I actually had to check the watch was right because I ended up doing the whole circuit, the whole run itself in 4 minutes and 13-second pace. So really interesting that, because the watch and the software and the Garmin software is just telling me my training's all off at the minute. Like the training is unproductive, the volume's too low, and all of that. Yet when it comes to actually just testing yourself and seeing how you're performing, actually it's just proved that the software really isn't always right, and try not to be a slave to your software and your watch and everything like that. So this video is mainly going to be about heart rate zones, and I'm going to get into that in a second. So I've got the final run to do tomorrow, which is just going to be an easier paced sort of 10 to 12K run, which I'm going to do tomorrow. And I'm going to go through the heart rate zones as well.
I will love you endlessly. If you only believe me, don't you think like that? I will love you endlessly. If you only believe me, don't you think like that? I will love you endlessly. Don't you think like that? I will love you endlessly.
So that's it. Zone 2 run done for today, and now I'm going to just hit up some strides and call it a day.
I will love you endlessly. If you only believe me, don't you think like that? I will love you endlessly. endlessly. If you don't believe in me.
So let's get into the nerdy business of heart rate training zones and how I've structured them for myself. Now, when it comes to heart rate training, I don't really live and die by the heart rate training zone that I'm in, but it does, the science that goes behind it kind of plays into the structure of how I set up my training. And when I actually go for a run, I tend to run more on feel, but then I might just look at my watch and see if I'm in the right sort of training zone and the right intensity for the outcome that I'm trying to get out of that session. So when you're setting up heart rate training zones, it's pretty important to know kind of what goes into aerobic performance, because that dictates your training, and the heart rate training zones is what we're using in the training. So broadly speaking, you've got three main areas. You've got VO2 max, which is like the size of the engine. You've got lactate threshold, which is kind of like how well you use the capacity of that engine. And then you've got running and economy, which is all to do with kind of the efficiency of how it works. So if we have a look at VO2 max, you'll see that kind of like your elite athletes, they'll have a VO2 max of like 70 to 90 milliliters per kg per minute. That's how much oxygen they're consuming. And you can see, if you liken it to the size of the engine, if you look at like the mere mortals like me, most of us might have a VO2 max of about 40 to 60. And so that engine is much smaller. So you've got much less to work with from the start. So those athletes are like way ahead on that scale. But what makes things interesting is when you start to factor in lactate threshold into all of this. So if we take the same two runners, runner 1, runner 2, they've both got the same VO2 max, but they've got different lactate thresholds. And the lactate threshold is just the point at which lactate starts to build in the blood and the muscle, and the associated hydrogen ions cause fatigue basically. And this starts to happen at a certain exercise intensity. So runner 1 here is his lactate threshold, or her lactate threshold, happens at about 85% of their VO2 max, whereas runner 2 happens at 75%. So that means runner 1 can work aerobically, which means they can sustain it for a long time, all the way up until about 85%. So they can work at a higher heart rate for a longer period of time, whereas runner 2 will hit a certain heart rate that's lower and won't be able to go beyond that point. So the lactate threshold is really important to developing performance. It kind of so much so that it actually is probably more the determining factor. So if you take someone who has a higher VO2 max, say in this example like 60, compared to someone with a slightly smaller VO2 max, so 55, but the smaller VO2 max has a higher lactate threshold, it might be the case that they can still compete with that runner who has a higher VO2 max. So kind of the obvious question is, how do you improve each one of those things, those facets that improves aerobic performance? So VO2 max, there's loads of things that play into it, but the main one is stroke volume, and that is the amount of blood that the heart can pump round within one beat or within 1 minute. So that's the main thing we want to focus on there. Lactate threshold, there's I think probably debate within certain literature about what really works for this, but it's probably a combination of things, such as how much mitochondria you have within your muscles. So those are the little aerobic powerhouses that create lots of ATP from oxygen. The maximal heart rate which you can oxidize kind of purely fatty acids. The economy, which is kind of there on the right as well, and also the tolerance. So like training at that lactate threshold is quite hard work, so you kind of got to be able to tolerate it. And then of course, moving on, you've got economy, which doesn't really kind of play into our heart rate training zones as such, but you can improve it through things like technique, strength training, carbon shoes, beetroot juice as well. Look up Andy Beetroot, he's done loads of work on it, but actually that can help. If you want to improve your VO2 max, you've got to improve your stroke volume, and you've got to do that by treating your heart like a muscle. So when you train at high intensities, you're working your heart really hard, and then it recovers and it gets stronger, and then you can pump more blood out per beat per minute. So that kind of figures, this type of training has got to be kind of high intensity intervals, break, high intensity intervals, break. Think of it as like strength training, but for your heart. And then lactate threshold is probably working on that aerobic base more than anything. So I've talked about fat max here, which is the intensity which you burn the most amount of fat. And after that point, you start to dip in much more to your glycogen stores or or carbohydrate stores. So that's the point that you want to improve as much as possible. So by improving your aerobic capacity, you shift the lactate threshold, that red marker, over a little bit further because you're improving your ability to oxidize fats and oxidize carbohydrates aerobically. And there's other ways to improve it as well. So improving your tolerance, so training at high intensities at around about your lactate threshold, so you can get used to kind of that burn and that pain sensation that comes through with it. So where I'm at the minute, according to my Garmin, which again I would have hoped to have more accurate numbers, but this is the best I've got. My VO2 max is 56. My maximum heart rate is probably about 189 beats per minute, and my resting heart rate is 47. So my lactate threshold, according to my Garmin, is 169 beats per minute, which equates to about 80% of my VO2 max. So that's the point at which if I go over that, I'm going to start to struggle and fatigue. And then fat max is estimated at around about 145 beats per minute. And there's some evidence to suggest that the maximal rate of fat oxidation happens about 65% of VO2 max. Again, if I'd done like a proper test in a lab, I'd get more accurate data on that, but I'm using that because I've got nothing else better to use. And through that, I've basically formulated my heart rate training zones. So zone 1 is basically anything under 135 beats per minute. For me, that's kind of like walking or power walking or hiking up a hill or something like that, which is when I'm going to be in that zone. Zone 2 and zone 3 are very much aerobic training zones. They kind of give the same response, but we're probably using different fuel sources for both of them. And I kind of believe that it's good to have a muscle that's kind of flexible. It can oxidize fatty acids and it can oxidize carbohydrates. So you kind of want one that does both. For example, if you charge up a hill, you're going to start oxidizing more carbohydrates, so you're going to want to be able to access those quickly. Similarly, if you're having to take on loads of gels because you're doing a marathon and you've got to fuel yourself, you need to be able to oxidize those gels. But similarly, we want to be really good at oxidizing fatty acids as well, because that is going to spare our glycogen stores for later in the run when we really need them. So zones 2 and 3 pretty much do the same thing. But zone 2 is mainly focused on oxidizing fatty acids because it's below that fatty acid maximal rate, which is 65% of VO2 max. And then zone 3 is a little bit harder running, but it's still very much aerobic. And that's actually the zone I prefer training in because you feel like you're getting a good run, but it's quite manageable and you can run for quite a long time. And then you kind of go into zone 4. So this is when we're gonna kind of start improving things like VO2 max and lactate threshold through greater tolerance and working the heart rate like a muscle. And then zone 5 isn't really a zone I will train in very much. It's more one of those zones which, when I'm doing some really high intensity work, I'll probably end up going into that zone, but it's not as if I'm going to say, right, today is the zone 5 training day. So basically here we've got zone 2, zone 3, both aerobic training. Zone 2 is going to work more fatty acid oxidation. Zone 3 is going to be working more carbohydrates. Zone 4 is more for improving VO2 max and improving tolerance to lactate threshold. And then zone 5 is just where we're going to go when we're working at those really hard efforts. So you might sort of say, well, why don't you just always train in zone 3? Because you're going to get more bang for your buck, you're working harder, but it's still aerobic. The truth is like when you're training for a marathon, you're going to be training for about 2.5 to 5 hours or so. You're going to be running for that amount of time in the race. So you've got to condition your body to doing that. And to do that, you've got to do loads of running. And you can't do it all in these higher intensity zones because when you're running at a higher pace, you're creating more impact on the legs. It's more stress on the body and you need to recover from that. And if you're trying to get like 60 miles a week in or something like that, you're going to burn your body out. So zone 2 running comes in really handy for managing volume and getting a training stimulus and increasing mileage. So to kind of like summarize it all, heart rate training zones highlight the purpose of training in different intensities. Every intensity has a different purpose. And from a practical sense, I tend to run more on feel and I use the heart rate zones to kind of structure my overall training. And like I said, the marathon itself is anywhere between 2.5 to like 5 hours long. Zone 2 running really allows you to get a good aerobic stimulus in your training whilst increasing volume and managing recovery. But periods of more like intense training should be factored into your training to improve VO2 max and tolerance to help improve lactate threshold, not to mention things like technique and everything like that. So there you have it. That is my approach to heart rate zone training. It's not an exact science, but it sort of gets you in the right ballpark for managing your intensity, not burning out, and getting the kind of specific adaptations that you want out of your training. That's it for now. Next video, I'll go through kind of exactly how I've structured my training plan right up until the marathon day itself. And remember, I'm doing this for the Alzheimer's Society, so if you found any of the information useful today, please do donate. That would be really helpful. I'm trying to get to £1,000 by the time the marathon starts, and that would be massively appreciated. So thank you very much, and check in next time.